The press conference in Paris was meant to be routine. Emmanuel Macron stood before the cameras, speaking with the polished arrogance of a man who had inherited a system built on centuries of dominance. Behind him hung the flags of France and the European Union, fluttering in the air-conditioned breeze of the Élysée Palace. As former colonies, Macron declared, many African nations owe much of their infrastructure, institutions, and economic foundations to France. We built your nations. That single line triggered a storm far beyond the borders of Europe. In Ouagadougou, the response came within hours. A special press briefing was called. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso and the rising symbol of African defiance, stepped up to the podium. There was no French flag behind him, only the bold colors of Burkina Faso and a map of Africa etched in gold. With piercing eyes and a tone that cut through the noise, Traoré leaned into the microphone. On our backs, he said. On the broken bones and stolen lives of our people. You built your empires from the blood that soaked our soil, not out of generosity, but greed. And now you speak of loyalty. He paused, scanning the room. No teleprompter, no scripted response. Just truth. We owe you nothing, he continued. What you see today is not because of France, but despite France. We've carried the weight of foreign rule, of economic sabotage, of cultural theft, and still we rise. Social media exploded. Within minutes, #WeUnothing and #TraorSpeakstruth were trending worldwide. Young Africans cheered in markets, in classrooms, in military camps. Even African diaspora communities in Europe and the US rallied behind his words. Macron's statement, intended to reinforce France's historic importance, had backfired. What was meant to be a show of legacy became a catalyst for resistance. And Traoré, calm, bold, and unwavering, had just drawn the line. The French president's words echoed across the continent, amplified by every news outlet, dissected by pundits, mocked in memes, and deconstructed in university lecture halls. Macron's statement wasn't just dismissed, it was dissected like a relic of a dying age. In cafes across Dakar, students laughed, they still think they own us. In Johannesburg, activists sprayed murals reading, built on our backs, not with your hands. But it was in Ouagadougou that the most striking scene unfolded. Traoré didn't stop at one speech. He called for a national broadcast, one where he addressed not just France, but the entire post-colonial world. The camera panned to him standing in a museum, surrounded by stolen African artifacts now returned from Europe. Symbolism was everything. France says it built our nations, Traoré said. What nation was built when our children were denied education, our resources stripped, our languages banned, our kings imprisoned? He walked through the corridors, hand brushing across glass casings holding looted masks and sacred items. They built railroads to carry away our gold. They built schools to erase our identity. They built courts to punish our resistance. That's not a gift. That's theft with a blueprint. Outside, thousands gathered to watch on massive screens. This wasn't just a response to Macron, it was a reclamation of history, a reminder to all African leaders still clinging to the illusion of Western favor. Meanwhile, in Paris, the Élysée scrambled. Macron's advisors advised damage control, but the damage wasn't political, it was symbolic. A generation that once looked to Paris for opportunity now looked to Ouagadougou for inspiration. Africa was no longer silent. And Traoré's voice had become thunder. Back in France, Macron's cabinet was under pressure. Protests in West Africa had spread beyond Burkina Faso. Young people in Mali, Niger, and even Senegal now marched with placards reading, "We owe you nothing." The narrative had shifted. It wasn't about diplomacy anymore. It was about dignity. Macron tried to reframe his statement. He appeared on international media, smiling tightly. "I spoke of loyalty not as debt, but as shared history," he said. But no one was buying it, especially not Ibrahim Traoré. In a private interview aired to millions, Traoré leaned forward and said, "They call it shared history, but history isn't shared when one side bleeds and the other profits." He paused, eyes locked on the camera. When a thief returns what he stole, do we owe him loyalty for the gesture, or do we demand justice for the decades of silence? The message hit like a drumbeat. In a surprising turn, Traoré invited African leaders to Ouagadougou for a summit, not to discuss aid, but to discuss autonomy. "We don't need permission to own our future," he said in the opening speech. "We're not asking for investment, we're demanding respect." That day, a new coalition was formed, the Pan-African Sovereignty Pact. The founding principle was clear: no foreign military bases, no exploitation of natural resources without full equity, and no recognition of colonial-era debts. France panicked. Economic advisors warned Macron that uranium deals with Niger were collapsing, and gold access from Burkina Faso was being renegotiated under new, non-European terms. The IMF called for moderation, but Traoré wasn't listening. "To build our future," he declared, "we must tear down the scaffolding of theirs." And just like that, the illusion of dependency shattered. Macron's administration scrambled. Old alliances in West Africa were unraveling faster than anyone anticipated. French diplomats attempted to re-engage with Burkina Faso, offering infrastructure partnerships and renewable energy investments, diplomatic sugarcoating for control. But Traoré had learned the language of empires, and he had no interest in translation. During a press conference in Accra, he stood beside Ghanaian officials and addressed reporters from around the globe. "We're not anti-Europe," he clarified. "We're anti-manipulation. There's a difference between building together and building over us." France's counter-narrative painted Traoré as a radical nationalist, a dangerous demagogue pulling Africa away from the civilized world. But the more they labeled him, the louder his echo grew. Traoré turned colonial guilt into global debate. University students across Africa cited his speeches. Even youth in the Caribbean began hosting panels titled, "The Burden of Gratitude." One slogan went viral: "You don't owe the architect of your cage." Meanwhile, Macron tried symbolic gestures, removing select colonial statues in Paris, offering scholarships to African students. But symbolism couldn't erase systems, and Traoré knew that. In Ouagadougou, as thousands gathered under the sun, Traoré delivered what would be known as the ledger speech. "If they want to talk numbers," he said, "let's count. Count the rubber, the gold, the blood, the bodies. Count the broken families. Count the languages erased. And when you're done counting what they took, ask if loyalty still sounds like a fair exchange." That quote made headlines in 6 continents. Macron's foreign ministry issued a terse response: France regrets the deterioration of relations and calls for mutual respect. But Traoré had already moved on. He met with South American leaders, Pacific nations, and even Eastern European countries interested in new trade models, without former colonial middlemen. And when asked if he feared France retaliating through economic sanctions, he replied with a grin: "We've survived worse than silence. We'll survive their noise too." As Traoré's voice reverberated across the continent, his critics in the West struggled to frame him. Not quite a rebel, not quite a diplomat, he was rewriting the playbook. And the French establishment found itself in unfamiliar territory, being challenged not by warlords, but by words that wounded deeper than bullets. Macron's advisors urged for containment. "Don't escalate," they warned. "Ignore him, and he'll fade." But Traoré didn't fade. He flourished. Instead of staging protests, he organized summits. Instead of burning flags, he built schools. And yet, every move he made felt like a direct affront to centuries of French dominance in the region. Then came the viral moment that ignited global discourse. A European journalist asked Traoré during a panel, "Do you truly believe Africa can prosper without Western guidance?" Traoré leaned forward, calm but piercing. "Guidance is chosen. Chains are forced. We're not rejecting the world, we're rejecting your terms." That clip amassed 80 million views in 24 hours. From Johannesburg to Rio, from Paris to Port-au-Prince, the world leaned in. Memes erupted. Commentaries swirled. Even Macron's own citizens began questioning their government's posture abroad. But the French president was under pressure. Corporate lobbyists demanded access to mining contracts in Mali and Burkina Faso. Military analysts feared Russian and Chinese expansion in West Africa. Macron couldn't appear weak. So he authorized Operation Resilience, an intelligence initiative aimed at monitoring destabilizing influences in Francophone Africa. Traoré, of course, was target one. Traoré knew this. And he didn't flinch. In a closed-door meeting with regional leaders, he presented a framework, the Continental Sovereignty Accord. It called for shared security protocols, resource nationalization, and a media coalition to combat foreign narratives. It was bold, risky, revolutionary. And just like that, Traoré wasn't just a Burkinabe leader, he was becoming the architect of a post-colonial era. As whispers of the Continental Sovereignty Accord rippled across Africa, the West responded not with diplomacy, but disruption. In Paris, London, and Washington, think tanks scrambled. Reports began labeling Traoré a populist agitator. Editorials painted him as a threat to regional stability, a code word often used when influence was slipping away. Yet Traoré didn't blink. In a bold move, he opened Burkina Faso's national reserves for independent audit, daring other African leaders to do the same. Transparency was his weapon now, and the people responded with roaring support. "Let them see what's ours," he said. "Then they'll understand what was stolen." Meanwhile, Emmanuel Macron, watching from the Élysée Palace, summoned his foreign ministry. "Control the narrative," he ordered. So Western media aired segments showing chaos in African markets, insecurity on roads, and desperation among youth. But phones don't lie. On TikTok, Instagram, and WhatsApp, young Africans shared the truth: local farms expanding, clean water systems emerging, community radio stations broadcasting in native dialects for the first time. The revolution wasn't televised. It was going viral. Then, Traoré made his most controversial move yet. He invited every African head of state to Ouagadougou for a historic summit, one that would define the new pact. No Western observers allowed. No IMF. No World Bank. Just Africa speaking for Africa. The West saw it as provocation. Macron sent a final private warning. "Pull back, or France will be forced to act." Traoré's reply was immediate and chilling. "Act, and bury your legacy beside your threats." It was no longer about France. It was about centuries of suppression, coming undone with every word Traoré spoke. He didn't need armies, his ammunition was awakening. And in that moment, the world realized something profound. This wasn't a rebellion. It was a reckoning. In the days following Macron's veiled threat, an unusual silence stretched across official French channels. No press briefings. No diplomatic communiques. Just quiet tension, the kind that comes before a storm. But Traoré? He was louder than ever. He delivered a speech in Bobo-Dioulasso, not from behind bulletproof glass, but among farmers and street vendors under the scorching Sahel sun. "They say we owe them loyalty. For what? For centuries of silence? For gold taken in crates and returned as debt?" The crowd erupted. What followed was unprecedented. Country after country began canceling French-language broadcasts, replacing them with local dialect news. School curriculums in Mali, Guinea, and Burkina Faso were revised, colonial history no longer told through the lens of empire builders, but through the stories of resistance. France responded by freezing development aid. But Traoré laughed. "Their aid is a leash," he said. "And we've already chewed through it." Meanwhile, in Brussels and Washington, analysts began to whisper what few dared say out loud. What if France has lost Africa? In desperation, Macron attempted one final gambit. He proposed a multilateral reconciliation conference, to be held in Geneva, inviting Traoré and select African leaders. But Traoré declined on live TV with a smirk. "We don't need to be reconciled with you. We need to recover from you." And then came the final fracture. On the anniversary of Burkina Faso's independence, Traoré ordered the removal of the last French military outpost on Burkinabe soil. No shots were fired. No force was used. Just a line of young soldiers, marching with silent pride as they lowered the French flag for the final time. One soldier folded it carefully and handed it to the departing commander. "Merci," he said. "But it's over." The image went viral. Across Africa, people wept. In France, Macron sat alone at his desk, watching the footage loop. His empire hadn't fallen with war. It had vanished with a whisper. The world was watching now. What started as a clash of words had ignited a continent-wide conversation. Traoré's defiance wasn't just about Burkina Faso, it had become a rallying cry for every nation still haunted by the ghosts of colonialism. In an exclusive interview with a Pan-African news channel, Traoré sat calmly, dressed in his signature fatigues. "They say they built our nations," he said, eyes locked on the camera. "But whose hands laid the bricks? Whose blood watered the soil?" The interviewer asked if he believed reparations were necessary. Traoré didn't flinch. "We don't want handouts. We want acknowledgement. Accountability. And above all, autonomy." Across Europe, the interview sparked panic among policy circles. In Paris, lawmakers debated sanctions. In Berlin, diplomats tried to salvage relations. In Rome, silence reigned. No one knew how to respond to a man who didn't ask, but demanded, respect. And then came the rally. 1 million people flooded the streets of Ouagadougou. From rooftops hung massive banners. "We built this. Now we own it." The French embassy shut its doors. Still, Traoré's movement wasn't about violence, it was about awakening. Schools adopted new curricula. Streets were renamed. Statues of colonial heroes were removed peacefully, replaced by local leaders, freedom fighters, and forgotten legends. France sent an envoy. Traoré refused to meet him. "When your hands are still red," he said, "don't offer peace. Wash them first." But perhaps the most powerful moment came days later, when a young girl, no older than 10, stood in front of a crowd and recited words that would echo across the internet. "My grandfather built roads with chains on his ankles. My father built a house with no help from Paris. And I will build a future where no child learns to kneel." The crowd roared. The world listened. And Macron? He issued a brief statement calling for mutual understanding. But it was too late. The winds had shifted. And Africa was walking, no longer in chains, but on its own 2 feet. As the global media tried to downplay Traoré's rise, a different reality pulsed across the streets of Africa. Burkina Faso had become more than a nation, it had transformed into a symbol. A new mural appeared overnight in Ouagadougou, a giant portrait of Traoré with the words, "You took our gold. You will not take our dignity." That morning, Macron delivered a televised address. "France has always acted with good intentions in Africa. We offered civilization, roads, progress." He paused, awaiting applause. But none came. Instead, Twitter erupted. One reply, liked over 1 million times, simply read, "You offered chains. We paved our own roads with broken links." In the Sahel, Traoré stood on a rusted train platform, one that used to transport minerals out of Africa and into the ports of Marseille. His voice echoed through loudspeakers as thousands gathered. "They say they built us railroads," he shouted. "But never told you what they carried away." The crowd thundered in response. Diplomats scrambled. France offered investment packages, cultural exchange programs, even military assistance. Traoré said no. "If it comes with your flag," he told an advisor, "it comes with a leash." That same week, African historians unveiled the Ledger of Loss, a document cataloging centuries of stolen artifacts, resources, and lives. Pages went viral. TikTok creators broke down its entries. Schools began to teach it. Meanwhile, an ex-French intelligence officer leaked files showing past efforts to manipulate African elections, including one aimed at stopping Traoré's rise. The backlash was fierce. Protests ignited in Dakar, Bamako, Kinshasa. In Paris, Macron's popularity plummeted. Graffiti appeared on the Champs-Élysées. "Built your empire on stolen bones." And in one of the boldest moves yet, Traoré addressed the UN General Assembly. He didn't read from a script. He didn't wear a suit. He stood tall in military green and said, "If our nations are poor, it's because your pockets are full. But we've found the leak. And now, we tighten the belt, not around our people, but around your lies." A silence fell over the room. History was no longer written by the colonizers. This time, the ink belonged to Africa. As the world watched in stunned silence, the final blow wasn't a missile or a speech, it was a movement. In the heart of Ouagadougou, Traoré unveiled the Independence Monument. Not the old colonial statue that once stood tall but a new structure, an African child breaking a chain in one hand and holding a book in the other. A flame burned behind it, eternal. Traoré stood at its base and addressed not just Burkina Faso, but all of Africa. They built monuments for men who stole our fathers. We will build monuments for children who will never be enslaved. At that moment, African leaders began arriving, Guinea, Mali, Niger, even Congo. No interpreter needed. They all spoke the same language, resistance. Meanwhile, Macron tried to salvage what remained of France's diplomatic grip. He proposed a joint reconciliation summit. But Traoré declined. "You don't reconcile with thieves," he told the press. "You indict them." In a symbolic act, Burkina Faso revoked every colonial-era treaty still active. The crowd roared. In response, European media scrambled to reshape the narrative. Pundits called Traoré radical, dangerous, even unstable. But in the streets of Johannesburg, Nairobi, Accra, murals went up with a new title under his image: Africa's Unbought Voice. Traoré's last move before retreating from the public eye for a week was poetic. He published an open letter, titled "To the Sons of the Empire." In it, he wrote, "If you inherit a throne built on bones, do not mistake it for a legacy. The earth remembers. And she has begun to shake." The internet broke. The letter was translated into 47 languages, read aloud in schools, remixed into rap lyrics, carved into walls. Even in Paris, a protester held up a sign during a government hearing. "You warned him. He woke us." And somewhere, far from cameras and microphones, Traoré walked barefoot along a riverbank where colonizers once crossed. Not with soldiers. Not with gold. But with history watching, finally, through the eyes of those who wrote none of it, yet lived all of it. Africa was no longer rising. It had risen.